Hello, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. You are at the second webinar of our Unpacking the Carbon Credit Conundrum series. I'm Leah Potterwaite. And we are recording today. We are going to ask, though, if you could keep your cameras and mics off, only to make it so we don't take up so much bandwidth. As much as we'd love to see your faces, it's just going to help us feel like we can do this without things shutting down. So thank you for understanding. If you need anything, you can message me or message Christine. We can help with any tech issues you have. It's an hour and a half long, so take breaks as you need. We like to practice confident humility, and by that, we mean that we each bring so much wisdom and experience, and then we all have things to learn. This is a complicated subject, carbon markets, and together we can learn so much more. So Q&A will be towards the end after the 3 presentations. So you can drop your questions in the chat. We will be paying attention to those. So thank you for your patience as we hear from our presenters and then get to the Q&A. And then I'd also just like to invite folks to just take a couple breaths or stretch or do something to kind of ground into your body. Maybe you're coming from another meeting that you were just in online or from your emails, and let's just land here in this moment. If you want, I have a nervous system regulation technique I like to do when I'm on the computer. You can indulge me and join me, or not. I won't even know because your cameras are off. But you can inhale, exhale, bringing your hands in, inhaling out, exhale, bringing your hands in. And then one more, inhale. And exhale, bring your hands in. Thank you. Yeah, just always nice to just get back in our bodies after doing so much stuff online. And I'd also like to share a land acknowledgement. You know, a lot of us, we work in regenerative agriculture, and at its root, regenerative agriculture comes from Indigenous knowledge, and it feels important to continue to recognize that. And even though we're meeting online, we're all located on land, and that land is Indigenous. Where I am is Apache, Comanche, and Pueblo land. You are more than welcome to share a land acknowledgement in the chat if you know that information. We'd love to hear it. And in addition to acknowledgement, we always encourage folks to get involved, learn about Indigenous-led organizations where you live, see how you can support Indigenous sovereignty in the region where you are. So I'm Leah Potterwaite. Like I said, I manage education and outreach at the Quivira Coalition. We are a nonprofit based out of Santa Fe or Ogopoge in New Mexico. And through education, innovation, and collaboration, we work in coalition with ranchers, farmers, government agencies, and land stewards to foster resilience on working lands. If you want to hear more about what we do, feel free to visit our website. I'll share it in the chat. Also, you can reach out to me. We love to connect. And we're so happy to be partnering with Soil Carbon Solutions Center on this. And I'll pass it to Christine to share about the SCSC.
Thanks, Leah. Hi, everyone. I'm Christine Rost. I'm a research associate with the Soil Carbon Solutions Center. I recently graduated with my master's in greenhouse gas management and sustainable food systems. I also grew up in Southwest Iowa on my family's farm, where I was introduced to responsible land stewardship from a young age, and that has shaped me into the person I am today, very passionate about sustainable agriculture. CSU Soil Carbon Solutions Center was founded in 2021 and leverages world-class expertise to build the tools needed to accelerate the deployment of credible soil-based climate solutions, measure their impact, and bring them to scale. The center has over 50 active members, and our team is rapidly growing. And before we introduce our presenters, it's important to us that we acknowledge that carbon markets may not be accessible or feasible for everyone. In this webinar, we'll explore some creative alternatives and also discuss emerging opportunities, equity, and access in our final webinar.
Yeah, and to add to that framing, We did not manage to secure a crop farmer who's working in carbon markets for the webinar today. We are excited to hear from Nori, who works with crop farmers, so Jada will share about that. However, we did have a crop farmer reach out to us who's tried to get into carbon markets, Anna Jones Crabtree, and she had a lot of interesting things to say about her research and attempts there. And so we're going to share an article she wrote in our follow-up email if you want to learn more about her. So, but yeah, we're so excited to have Jada here today too to help share more about crop farming at the end of the webinar.
We also have 2 more webinars after this one, and they will use the same Zoom link, and we hope you can join us. But if not, they'll be recorded, and the recording will be sent out to all registrants. Leah, do you want to share this page?
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to find my unmute. So we just wanted to share just a little bit about who the registrants or attendees are here today. And so this was taken last week, so we've had a few registrants since then. But about 30% of the folks who registered for this are producers, which makes us super happy because we're really trying to create an experience that is supportive of producers to help them figure out whether carbon markets are a good fit for them, and if they are, how to do that in a way that's thoughtful and supports their own work. And but we also found we have a lot of folks from nonprofits and foundations here today, and some folks from carbon market companies themselves. So we're always happy to see everyone who shows up, and we're glad that we're coming together around these conversations.
So today, our webinar will be 90 minutes long, and will also include a 5-minute break in between speakers. We will follow up the presentations with a 20-minute Q&A, and I'll be looking over the chat to share questions with our presenters. And you can go to the next slide, Leah. And I can introduce all of our speakers. We have Kris Hulvey, who will first talk about her work with working lands. We have Bill Milton, a rancher in Montana, the owner and operator of Milton Ranch. And we have Jada, a supply account manager with Nori Carbon. And with that, Kris, if you want to go ahead and share your screen.
Absolutely. Okay. Do you see my screen?
Yep.
Excellent. Good morning, everybody. I'm really excited to be a part of this. My name is Kris Hulvey. I am the lead scientist at a small nonprofit called Working Lands Conservation. We are based in Logan, Utah, and our mission is to work collaboratively with partnerships of ranchers and agency folks and other scientists. We're a group of ecologists and communicators, and we fill gaps in science in those multi-stakeholder collaborations so people can advance their land management goals and missions. So today I get to share about some of the work that we're doing here in Utah, focused on ranching and the carbon markets. To give you an idea of what I'm going to talk about, just a little overview, I want to talk a little bit first about soils and carbon storage, linking grazing to that picture. Last week, we had a great overview by Jane and Megan on carbon market basics. I want to do a little refresher about how our ranchers are trying to get into the carbon market. And then I'm going to really go into this Utah example some more. Just kind of lay some foundation, some groundwork. When people think of carbon markets, they're thinking about a lot of things. One thing that we think about is stewardship. We think of soil carbon and carbon sequestration as just one of the important things that our rangelands in Utah do. So they provide water retention, biological diversity, nutrient cycling, food production, and carbon storage is another great ecosystem function. And we really think about not dividing that ecosystem function out from all the other things the rangelands can do for stewardship and conservation. I want to talk a little bit about how we go about linking grazing management to soil carbon. And to understand that, we want to think a little bit about what what are the features and the factors in soil that really allow for those soils to sequester carbon. And we have a whole constellation of factors. These include precipitation. So what is the climate like? We know that wetter climates can, with more precipitation, often have soils that build up larger stores of soil carbon. If you look at where we are in the Utah West, you can see this map. It shows a lot of red space, right? That is dry area. So we don't have a lot of precipitation out here in Utah. So there's some questions about, how much carbon can our soil store? Another really important characteristic of soils for thinking about storing soil carbon is soil texture. So textures can range from sandy to clayey to silty, and certain of those textures really bind with soil carbon better than others. So silts and clays bind carbon better, let's say, than sands. So also thinking about the texture of the soils where you are located. The third factor that can help contribute to soil carbon storage is vegetation. So when you have areas with lots of herbaceous vegetation, with plants with deep roots, those plants are acting like little carbon pumps, taking carbon dioxide out of the air, bringing it into the plant. That carbon is, shuttled into roots. When the roots die, that's one way that carbon can enter the soil. So the amount of vegetation you have on your landscape can be another contributing factor. So wetter areas with less sand and more clay, areas with lots of vegetation cover with plants with deeper roots, these are all things that can lead to soil carbon storage. And while we can't control all of those things, one thing we can control is the management of landscapes, and that's another really important factor when you're thinking about building soil carbon. Now, what we're thinking a lot about in our rangelands in Utah is how grazing might be a management strategy we could use to increase soil carbon. And so when we think about the interactions with grazing and soils, we might think about it like this. So in some areas, if you're overgrazing, you might do a number of things to your system that decrease the potential for that system to sequester carbon. So for example, those cattle trample the ground. That can really increase the bulk density of soils, making that ability for that water to infiltrate through those soils less, not allowing roots to grow as deep, so really limiting the ability of those plants, those carbon pumps, to get carbon dioxide into the soils. And if you compare that to a system with no grazing, well, you might have more potential for carbon to get stored in that soil. You don't have as much soil compaction, you have more water infiltration, but what happens in our semi-arid climates is that without a disturbance, you often get a lot of decadent material that builds up on top of that soil surface. So a lot of dead standing grass. We really want that biomass to get churned into the soil to get that soil carbon in. And so you can think of how a managed grazing system might get you to kind of a sweet spot. So not too much compaction, but enough disturbance so that some of that decadent material is moved into the soil. So that's what we're thinking about here in Utah. And as an organization, we are working with ranchers and asking a couple of questions. So we're thinking about how much soil carbon can semi-arid rangelands store, considering that we have not that much precipitation, considering that some of our soils can be pretty sandy, but thinking about how we might use management as a tool to increase that potential. And so that's the second question we're really thinking about, is how grazing management can increase soil carbon. Last week, we talked about the carbon markets a lot, and I want to briefly remind us of some of the steps that a rancher might go through if they're interested in getting into the carbon markets. So first, the rancher needs to be willing to change their management practices, because that's something we can control. We might be able to change our grazing, maybe add rotational grazing into our system that will favor the potential inputs of carbon into those soils. Once the rancher decides that they're willing to maybe change their grazing management, they work often with a project developer, and that is a group that will help design a project that, including maybe some of those changes in management, also designing a monitoring plan for measuring soil or carbon in the soils, and working with the rancher really to build out that project. So in that process, there's a contract signed between the developer and the rancher, and these new practices begin. Now, the project developer needs to do a couple things. They need to understand what the baseline is for existing carbon in that system. So they will probably do some initial monitoring and collect some information about the data stores that already exist. And what you want to do is over time, as you implement those new management strategies, you're going to want to figure out how much additional carbon was added to those soils. So they are going to take that data. They're also going to work with a third-party group that is going to independently verify that the methods that they're doing have the potential to sequester carbon, that they're following their plan as they set out in their project management documents, and that the measurements they're taking for assessing that soil carbon are good measurements, it's a good protocol, and verify that the project is indeed doing what it said it was going to do. After that, the project developer can negotiate the sale of those carbon credits, and it's after the sale of those carbon credits that the rancher gets paid. Last week, Jane and Megan gave us a couple of numbers about how much we're seeing on the markets right now for carbon offsets. So typical prices are ranging from $10 to $25 per ton of carbon dioxide. So I want to talk now a little bit about the project that we're doing here in Utah. I'll tell you about how our ranchers are thinking about going through this process and some of the barriers that we've run into and what our next steps are. So this project is taking place in northern Utah. It is called the Three Creeks Grazing Project. And the goals of our project are a couple. They don't only focus on soil carbon. So the main goals are to prevent the loss of grazing permits across this big landscape. Ranchers and agencies also want to improve range condition, but there is an interest in getting into the carbon markets. This area is big. It's 138,000 acres. So 56,000 hectares, and the ownership is mixed, which is unique in the carbon markets. We have public land, BLM, and Forest Service. We also have state land. There is also private land scattered through. So it's this real interesting matrix of land ownership. There are 38 ranchers that are involved in this project. 20 of them run cattle or sheep. And historically, this area was 10 separate grazing allotments. Historically, the area had been grazed using different grazing methods, and the ranchers have been on this landscape since the time of the Mormon pioneers. So for about 100 years, the rangeland has been grazed in very particular ways. So if you look at this map, some of the area had no rotation. So in the purple allotment, there was season-long grazing. And then we had some allotments that had what I call a static deferred rotation. So some pastures, the ones in green, were always grazed early in the season, and some pastures were always grazed later, the blue pastures. And what this did, these static timing and durations, we were guessing as scientists and managers had an effect on the soil carbon in these areas. Those grazing systems also had an effect on the landscape and the land health quality. So there were problems across this big public allotment because some areas look like this. So some riparians were in poor condition. There was questionable sage grouse habitat. The water quality wasn't meeting Utah state standards. And because of all that, the grazing permits were threatened to be removed, and they were appealed in 2001. And so what happened were ranchers in this area got together and asked, can we steward these lands differently? Can we do better so we can meet these land health standards and keep our cattle on this rangeland? What they ended up doing was joining together, forming a company, those 38 ranchers. They went through a NEPA process and consolidated those 10 different allotments into a single allotment. They also combined their different cattle herds into just two that they now run across this landscape using really different timing and duration than that had been used historically. So now what this might look like is for any single pasture, in 1 year, cows are on that pasture for about 2 to 3 weeks early in the season. The next year, they might be on that pasture for 2 to 3 weeks late in the season. And then in a third year, that pasture might be completely rested. So there's so much more rest that's been added into this system. And we really think that this added rest is going to have big effects on both carbon sequestration and all of these other ecosystem services that the ranchers and the other managers on this landscape are interested in. And so when we think about approaching the carbon markets, and this group thinks about approaching the carbon markets, the question isn't whether they can ultimately make a big profit off of the carbon markets, it's whether they can use the carbon markets as a tool to help fund the ongoing infrastructure needs of this new grazing project. So this is a map showing all the new water lines that were added across this Three Creeks area that now need to be upkept. And so we are hoping to enter the carbon markets to earn some profit so that we can reinvest them into the infrastructure across this big landscape. So here's been our process. So I outlined the general process. Our process has been to look for a project developer, and we tried to find some. We worked with a couple, and none of them fit our exact project. So it turned out that our group, our nonprofit, ended up working as the project developer. We took over the design of the monitoring system, chose a protocol, did the baseline sampling, and have done the initial calculation of carbon stocks in the area. We are currently working with a group that we are hoping is going to do the verification, and we plan to do the continued monitoring into the future to learn how much carbon has been sequestered across this landscape. And we are hoping to broker the sales. We know that it's sometimes hard for the small guys to do sales, so we might need to collaborate with some folks in order to do that piece as well. A little bit about the monitoring. A lot of people talk about how difficult it is to monitor carbon across these big landscapes, and our landscape is big. We used a methodology that's very common in all of the accepted protocols, which is to stratify the landscape. We stratified it according to grazing history, so those different historical management across our system, which I showed you a map of earlier. We also thought of other factors that might affect the ability for soils to hold carbon. Going back to that the introduction, we're thinking about texture, we are thinking about vegetation type, and we ended up using ecological sites as a really good way to parse that out across our landscape. And so we basically combined those two maps and came up with all of the diversity of different areas across our landscape that we thought could sequester carbon a little bit differently based off of those characteristics. We then sampled randomly across those areas and came up with some initial ideas of how much carbon was on our landscape. So I want to show you, this is my only data figure of the talk, but I think it's really neat to see some real data that has been collected on a big landscape. Let me talk you through this. So the green, orange, and pink bars are all the amount of carbon on our Three Creeks landscape. Those are the 3 different grazing histories on our landscape. Now the blue bar is from an adjacent ranch about 10 miles to the south called Desert Land and Livestock. They switched their grazing to the system we just implemented about 30 years ago. So they have a head start on us. And what we can see from this figure is that there is more carbon on that landscape than there is on ours. We are guessing that that could mean that in somewhere between 5 and 30 years, we're going to accrue more carbon on our landscape that would be eligible to sell into the carbon market. And that's really exciting to us. We don't know how long it's going to take, so we might have to wait a while. And before I end, I just want to come back to this point of multiple values on rangeland. So we are focusing on carbon. The reason we started focusing on carbon is because the ranchers in our project asked us if they could get into the carbon market with their new grazing strategy. So they were really excited about that. But they're also interested in all of these other landscape values that we've been monitoring for way longer than we've been monitoring carbon. And these are equally important, if not more important, to both the ranchers and the rangeland managers, like the BLM and the state that are working on this landscape. One of those, just to give you an example, is the health of the sage grouse population. Here's some pictures. Pictures are worth 1,000 words. This is the same stream before the implementation of our new grazing system and the year after, showing the difference in the amount of forage being produced along the stream. This was taken in the same month in September. So that's been really exciting to see those landscape changes. So the final thing I want to say is that, carbon offsets may be secondary to these other conservation outcomes and values that we have on the landscape. In our case, they may help to defray the cost of a big project. So just another way to think about why ranchers might want to think about carbon offsets. And with that, I will thank you and pass on the baton to Bill.
Yeah. So I'm on, I guess. Welcome everyone. Appreciate the invite. The background shots. I'm not gonna have a PowerPoint. I'm just gonna do more storytelling about our particular approach to this topic on our landscape and in our community. So a little historic context. Our family actually moved to Montana in the 50s. The first ranch the family bought ended up having to be sold because my father died young, and I moved around, and my wife and I located in Muscle County in central Montana in the late 70s. And we've been here since, raised a family, and are actually going through succession steps for the next generation. And things like carbon markets and other types of revenue to complement our ag operation, our livestock operation, are really important for our long-term resilience and viability. So historically, when we started ranching early on in the 80s, I got involved with holistic resource management and was intrigued by Alan Savory and that approach of how to use animals themselves to improve the landscape versus managing grasslands in a way to just try to mitigate the damage that livestock do. So quite a different approach where the animal actually becomes an asset versus a liability that has to be managed in a certain way to do as little harm as possible while still getting some benefit from your enterprise of harvesting forage and raising livestock. So we actually, about 40% of our land is public, and in order to apply a different type of grazing management, we had to get buy-in from BLM. And so we set up a 3-year process. Well, it took about 3 years to actually come up with a plan to implement. But what was important about that approach is it required, when we finally began implementing a plan where basically we began not unlike what Kris was sharing with the Three Creek ranchers, that what we were actually trying to do is concentrate herds, move more often, create higher stock densities, and create longer recovery periods. I think an interesting way that a Mexican rancher I think described it in a very simple way, is like, how do you graze as many animals as possible in the smallest space as possible for the shortest period of time as possible, while creating the longest recovery as possible? And then how do you do that while also maintaining effective and profitable performance from your livestock? So I, as well as a lot of the neighbors I work with and people up here in central Montana, we're all doing this at various levels. But the idea is how are we using our animals to create the most positive impact on our grasslands and on our soil while still maintaining performance? So getting back to the BLM and our story of changing grazing management, to get them to buy in to letting us do this back in the 80s was in itself going to be a bit of a stretch, because it wasn't this approach, even though Savory had been in the country doing a lot of schools, and even in the late 70s, there was a lot of resistance to this type of grazing, that it was actually going to create a big problem. And so luckily we had a person in BLM who had some faith and trusted, how we were approaching this. But the key thing is we're going to have third-party monitoring, as we go forward in this. And so that there would be monitoring done every year, and those reports would be presented to BLM and be shared with the public. We'd keep really close track of our grazing moves. And we do this reporting on a consistent level, and everybody would be seeing this information. So what happened, because we had to do this monitoring, we already were getting in, as a ranch business, we were already investing in this process of documenting and making credible that our actual grazing practices were benefiting the overall health of the landscape. At that time, we certainly weren't thinking about carbon sequestration or how that market might arise in the future. I think I was already beginning to think about climate change back then, but obviously this idea that there might be an opportunity to sequester carbon as a benefit to us and to the culture and to the world, that wasn't really on the table as some future opportunity. But fast forwarding up into now, that because we had shown success over the years using this particular grazing practice, we found ourselves creating relationships with nonprofits, with World Wildlife Fund, with Audubon, with Nature Conservancy, to do these different projects that would, optimize the benefits of wildlife, and grass, and what have you. So a company came into Eastern Montana called Native, which is a carbon credit type company. It's based in Vermont. They had begun they had already done a project in Kenya, and their unique approach to this is that their chief scientist had created this algorithm. And if you ask me, well, can I explain this algorithm? I can't. But basically, the next place they wanted to go to in the world was, for some reason, Eastern Montana. And they wanted to begin with sort of an experiment with 4 or 5 producers in central Montana. And I was actually invited to join that group. So we weren't actually actively seeking, like, gee, how can we make some revenue from sequestering carbon? We just simply were asked to be part of a project. And when we agreed to do that, I didn't then, and don't now, have this huge expectation of making a lot of money from trying to pull carbon out of the air and put it into our grasslands. Just the benefit of doing that practice, increasing organic matter, improving water infiltration, covering bare ground, all these things we measure, those in and of themselves are important risk mitigating, resilient kind of indicators that just make our business more resilient in the long term. Yet I was curious. I was really curious of like where God, can we actually successfully or measurably increase carbon? So I was willing to jump into this just out of curiosity, because as I learned listening to the last recording and part of discussions about carbon for the last 3 or 4 years, I appreciate this evolving science of trying to really understand, with many different types of farms and ranches and different ways of human beings figuring out how to get carbon out of the air and somehow try to mitigate this very challenging climate situation we have in our world. So I just want to be part of that game and to see what would arise. So the basic game plan for Native is this: if you're a player, they're going to provide some upfront investment in infrastructure, i.e., fencing, water development, even maybe even some classes, technical skills, but mostly infrastructure that would allow this practice of concentrating the animals, moving them more often, creating longer recovery periods, creating a little more impact, surface impact while they're there. Their algorithm, and you guys can call Native. I mean, it's kind of a cool company. They're really working well with our community out here. They're signing up more ranchers. They're not just this company as like, how can we make money off of carbon credits? They're seriously committed to the values of taking care of landscapes and working with communities. So we're happy to be working with them. But to their approach, they provide some investment dollars. They call it sort of a build out. That's their build out program for the first 5 years, up to around $75,000 over the course of the period, to develop those types of infrastructure. Not unlike what Kris was sharing with Three Creeks, water development, fences that allow you to manage the cattle a little more effectively. And then after that, as you put that infrastructure in, after that build out phase, through that whole process, they came in, they did the baseline, and they're tracking through their algorithmic model that is based on this particular type of grazing. They can project, and again, I think it's kind of magic, but they can project how many tons of carbon are being sequestered in the soil. So we got our first sort of report of the first 5 years just this year. And on the first 2 years of the project, it appeared that we sequestered enough carbon to pay for about 2/3 of that $75,000. Now, going forward, we'll eventually pay off that investment that they provided in infrastructure. And then after that, we'll start getting some actual direct revenue to the ranch for whatever carbon we do sequester as they measure going forward. How long that lasts, how much that will be, I have no idea. But it was surprising. That I thought in the first 2 years that we generated enough carbon to pay off that much of the infrastructure. And they shared, that of the ranchers involved, and they're all great, they're not all, neighbors right next to us, but they're in the 2 or 3 county area where we are. They did share that, we probably were sequestering a little bit more than the others, and we do have a little more intensive program. And for the scientists who are here, there's, whether there's a direct causal link because of all the variables that Kris and what you learned about in the last webinar, cause and effect relationship between, how tightly and effectively you can manage your cattle to create positive soil impacts, which affect vegetation, which affects soil, and affects water infiltration. I feel I've been on a learning curve on this for like 30 years and will continue to be on a learning curve. To just give you an idea, so like, yeah, what do you guys do? Like right now, we're in the middle of winter. It was about 6 degrees this morning. We don't have much snowpack. And for the last few weeks, we've been moving a herd of close to 300 cows. Well, we have actually 3 herds. We combine things in the growing season, but we got some bred heifers and we got some mature cows that calve in May. And we have our calves, our weaned calves. All 3 of those groups are moving either every day or every 2 days, and sometimes twice a day. And so we are, compared to maybe most, a little bit, a little obsessive about how we move our cattle. But, when I go out and walk through this landscape, the first thing every time I'm out there, and we do that all the time, is I'm always looking at the ground. I'm looking at the type of plants, but more important than anything, I'm really looking at how much of my ground is covered, because I know I'm in a relatively low rainfall landscape. Our average rainfall is probably, between, 8, 10, 12, 13 inches of moisture, sometimes as low as 6, sometimes as high as 20. Very, very much, very variable. But I know if I can cover this ground, that when it does rain, it's gonna go into the ground and not run off, and it's gonna stay in the ground longer. And that cover also is going to warm up sooner in the spring, cool off later in the winter. And so this cover and canopy is just huge. And we have come to experience through a fairly long practice that, and that's getting back to why we're moving so often right now, is this is the best opportunity before the growing season begins to actually graze and lay down litter. And the best way you can do that is by concentrating livestock. But you have to do it in a way, and we use a lot of temporary electric fence. And I also have this is really an important point here. We've been involved with the new agrarian program for about 5 years now. And having that person here to help with the moves has been huge in terms of up in the ante in terms of how often we move. But I can see every day, we look and we're changing all the time. Did we give them enough acres? Did we give them too few acres? But what we're trying to do is get as much impact as we can while not sacrificing the performance of the cattle. So those ranchers who are on the call appreciate this. Is we're in our last trimester before calving. This is not a time to be shortening your cattle. We do provide protein supplement, to help complement our low protein forages this time of year. So we're just threading that line between how can we get as much impact on the ground and while still providing enough feed and keep the cattle content and continue to improve their condition so they'll be in the right condition calving. So all this type of practice is apparently, at least in the short term, looks like we are sequestering some carbon. And it looks like we'll get some benefit from that in terms of adding a new revenue source, at least in the short term. How long that will last, I'm not sure. Like I've come to appreciate, I do think this science, the more people keep looking and evaluating, testing, and I really appreciate that Kris can bring the level of science and the documentation that she can do. We would love to have that level of documentation up here. But again, like native, they're using this algorithm this relationship between cows and grass and carbon. Now, the other thing I want to add, and because I remember at the very beginning, I saw a question is like someone said, well, how can a person with a small place take advantage of this? So while there's a few ranchers that got involved initially, I'm also part of a few groups here in eastern Montana. One is the Winter Aces, that's just north of us in Petroleum County, and farther north, the Rancher Stewardship Alliance, which is north of the Missouri River. These are rancher-driven nonprofits working with a lot of non-traditional partners, whose overall goal is not, oh wow, we're going to sequester carbon. Our overall goal is how do we sustain family ranchers? How do we help them with succession? How do we help each other create more resilient, more economically profitable places? And how do we do that as a community? And how do we work in this landscape as if it's a shared landscape? And this includes, you know, same with the tribal communities. We have a number of tribal communities in eastern Montana. Everybody in this landscape has to somehow work together to create an outcome across a large scale. So to this producer who asked that question, I think the most exciting opportunity going forward here is how ranchers could form kind of companies like Three Creeks, where they could scale not only an attribute like sequestering carbon, but all the attributes related to healthy open landscapes, healthy water, healthy riparian areas, supporting, diverse, wildlife populations. We have some key important birds here in the Northern Plains that are not endangered, but decline in bird species in the Northern Plains has been pretty dramatic, and so we're all linked into those kind of values as well. So there's just this whole package of trying to take care of the landscape, trying to take care of the community, and by everybody kind of working together and sharing what they're learning, we all kind of get lifted up on the same tide. So while we have done, and I know my time's about out here, but while we as an individual ranch family may be doing a little more aggressive things, in the end of the day, what's really going to make our business resilient is that the fact our neighbors are going to be resilient and the community is going to be resilient. So whatever things we can do to add value collectively through our individual efforts, that's cool. And so I'll stop right there. Thanks.
Thanks, Bill. That was wonderful. And I see all these great questions in the chat. And just as a reminder, we'll get to them. We probably won't get to all of them because there's so many, but we'll do our best to get through some after Jada speaks. So we're tracking those, Christine and I, as best we can. So for now, we're gonna take a little break. Just go to the bathroom, grab some water, or lay on the stairs like this figure is in the slide. Whatever you need. We'll see you at 11:52. Okay. All right. Well, we'll welcome everyone to come back from the break and inviting Jada to join us on screen on the digital stage.
Okay,
Great.
thank Do you guys see my screen? Oh,
No, yeah, not quite yet. Not
I'm
yet.
paused.
If it's not working, Jada, we could have Christine pull it up. Do you want to do that?
Yeah, if you would, Christine, it's not letting me share mine. Or it says that I am, but it's pausing it.
Oh, that's weird. I'm sorry about that.
Okay. So, hi everyone, my name is Jada. I am from Nori. We're a carbon marketplace and we're actually carbon agnostic. Just a little bit about us. Our first methodology is in soil carbon. So we work with suppliers, farmers that are making practice changes to regenerative practices. And later we are working through other methodologies, so potentially more permanent solutions like direct air capture and things like that. But our first methodology, like I said, is soil carbon. And I've always worked for quite a while with producers as a crop insurance agent before this. And so it's near and dear to my heart to work with farmers. Unfortunately, a lot of our growers are really busy right now trying to get everything prepared for the coming season. And so I want to give you a quick overview of Nori, but I also wanted to take some of the things that I've heard from growers about pain points and the benefits of working with Nori and present those to you. So first, I will talk a little bit about Nori though. So to qualify for our program, you do have to be in the US, and we use the DayCent or soil metrics, but it's based on the DayCent model. And so it works really well for row crops. Most of our growers are in the Midwest. We have a lot of growers from Iowa, but it is across the United States. And so we're always willing to see if it works for other people. And then the other thing that has to have happened is that you have made a regenerative practice change since 2014. And that's just every year that moves up one, so it has to be in the last 10 years. And the practice changes that we can model are tillage reductions, cover crops, adding perennials or lengthening growing seasons, adding biodiversity or organic matter. And it's sort of a simple process, but we'll get into some of the pain points about it in a minute. We do data enrollment. So you give us some data, we put it into a spreadsheet, we have an API with soil metrics and give you carbon projections. And so you can see those projections before actually signing a contract with Nori, which is really nice. So you can see whether or not it makes sense for you to go forward. So once you see those projections, you can say, okay, I want to verify my project. So you go into verification. The verification cost is paid for by the supplier. And so you do have to have a willingness to pay that cost. And I'll get into that in a few minutes too. But it's done by an independent third party, and they're basically asking for evidence that you have made the practice change that you are claiming and that it happened at the time that you're claiming. They're also verifying land ownership. That doesn't mean that you can't enroll if you don't own the land. You just have to have assignments of authority from the landowner that give you permission to include your project and that you can sign the contract for it. After the verification, you sign a contract that we'll go into in a minute too. And then Nori sells your credits and you are paid for the credits. You can go to the next slide, Christine. So as a supplier, what do I have to do? Like I said, we do have data requirements. We have to put in quite a bit of data for the day-cent model. And so we require historical data from 2000 and up to the present, and then 10 years past whatever your switch year is. So if you say that your switch year is 2015, we want data from 2000 to 2025. So some of that is going to be potentially future projection data. And what we're asking for are what was planted, what was the planting date, what was the harvest date. We want to know tillage types, if you're intensively tilling, if you're no-till, whatever you are, the dates for that, nitrogen and organic matter applications if you're irrigating, and basically whatever you're doing on the farm, we want to know. And so that does take a lot of data, but you have somebody to help you with it. Once you have that and you go through verification, the contract requirements for Nori, it's a 10-year commitment. You're saying that I will keep the carbon stored in the ground, and essentially that is continuing those practices. We do have a force majeure clause that if there is an act of God or an act of nature that causes you to have to do something non-regenerative, we understand that, and that wouldn't breach your contract. The other thing is that you'll continue to update Nori with annual data by March 31st every year. And that's essentially just saying, I want to know what you did. Did you actually plant what you had projected? Have you changed your tillage type? Are you continuing those practices? And then finally, you do have to verify the project every 3 years. And this is really for monitoring purposes. The verifiers, again, will kind of verify those same things in the last 3 years. Did you continue the practices? What evidence do you have of that? And some of the pieces of evidence that they would ask for would be geolocation stamped pictures. So if you have cover crops, they want to see pictures of that. If you've not been tilling, they want to see pictures of your farm. They want to know that it's in the place that you say. They can also ask for receipts for seeds, like sales receipts for tillage equipment, things like that. We can go to the next slide. So some of the points of frustration would be the time that it does take to enroll. So the data enrollment piece, because we're asking for a lot of that history, it could take some time. One nice thing about this, I would say, is that we do have a way to batch enter data in Nori's app. And so we can take an RCS satellite imagery and see what was planted and put general planting dates for your area. But we do need to know, like from your switch year, exactly what you were doing. We want to know all of those tillage events and things like that. So that part can take, depending on how communicative a farmer is with Nori and how much time you're willing to put into it up front, that can take even up to a couple of months. When you go into verification, this is actually the piece that does take longer, because it's another point where the farmer does have to be communicative with the verifier. And you have to remember, you've been working with Nori, and at this point, you're now working with an independent verifier. So that probably does feel a little bit disconnected, but to have an independent verification, that's really what buyers of these credits want to see. We don't want to have a conflict of interest that we're just verifying these, that everything is true. So the quickest verification that I've seen with our enrollments has been actually about 3 months. And again, it kind of depends on the time of the year. If you're going into verification in July and you're starting to harvest, that's a time that you're probably not going to be talking to the verifier. So it kind of pushes it out. So you have to stay really communicative with them. And whenever they have questions, answer them so that it goes as quickly as possible. But this could take, in the entire process, this could be half of that time. After the verification, you sign the contract and Nori sells your credits for you. And that part can take a little bit of time too. This actually sort of ties to that demand for soil credits too. The way that Nori works, we sell out whoever's in our marketplace queue. Let's say Christine and I are both in it. Christine will sell a farm, then I sell a farm, then Christine sells through a field rather, and then I sell through a field. So you don't get the full payment up front, which has pros and cons. One thing about that is that, I mean, maybe you want an entire payment up front, but Nori likes to say that we give you the option, you own your credit. And so we are selling it for you, but you own it. And so you're getting the money as it sells. Another thing that I think a lot of suppliers would change is that upfront work that you have to do before seeing your projections. You have to give us all of that historical data before you see whether or not your project is worth verifying. And again, there's pros and cons about that because you don't have to sign a contract until after your verification. So you know how much you'll earn before you even go into verification. But if you've done all of this work and then it turns out that you're not going to make enough money to cover the verification cost, or that you don't, it just doesn't feel as valuable to you, you've already done some of this work and now it's not worth it. The verification cost is $10,000 about for each project, and that's gone up over time. Nori started with the idea to keep verification costs really low, and part of that is that, so part of the reason that it's going up is that these are independent verifiers. They have a lot of projects because this is sort of a industry that's sort of booming at this point for projects for them. And so the verification cost has gone up. Obviously, we all know that input costs have gone up, inflation and all of these things. So they're raising their prices too. And so we're still looking for ways to keep that down. But right now it is about $10,000. So that actually, when you see your projections, you want to say, can I make enough to verify this project? You do have to verify every 3 years, as we saw with the contract, but every time you verify, you're also able to re-enroll and get another set of vintage credits. So you can get you can get about 0.6. So what we see is about 0.6 tons of carbon sequestered per acre per year. Nori gives vintages for the last 3 years. So right now we're giving vintages for 2021, 2022, and 2023. So when you verify in 3 years, you would also get the 3 years prior to that. So this does create sort of an income stream for you. But you do have to make enough to cover that verification cost. And again, the demand for soil credits is not necessarily always consistent. So if Christine is selling through a field, I have to wait until she sells through that field to get to mine. And so depending on what buyers are looking for, that part can take some time too. The fastest that we've seen, we were actually sold out for quite a while of our credits. So in 2022, excuse me, most of our credits were sold immediately. And then over time, that has kind of shifted. So we've gone from, sometimes we're selling 1,000 a month, sometimes we're selling 2,000 a month, sometimes we have sold 50,000 in a month. So that is something that we can't say it's going to take this much time and you'll see all of that money. We can go to the next slide. So some of the best parts of the process are that you are being paid for something that's already happened. So like we've talked about, Nori is a look back. And so if you've made a practice change in the last 10 years, you qualify for this. So one of the nice things is that to get into this program, you're not putting more money into making a practice change. It's something that you did on your own already. And so that's sort of creating a passive income stream for something that you've already done. This is hands-off in many ways. You do have to give Nori the information and the historical data and some of those things, but there is an account manager that inputs all of that for you and walks you through this process. the other side of seeing those projections before you go into verification is that you don't have to make a commitment. Once you see whether or not it's valuable, you decide, I want to go through verification or see you later. And then Nori sells the credits for you. You don't have to find a buyer for them, and you receive the entire payment. So Nori sells our credits for $20 a ton, and we do charge the buyer a 25% fee, so $5. So they're paying $25, but the entire cost of the credit is $20 and goes directly to the farmer, which is really nice too. So we can go to the next slide. And this sort of just covers this again. Like, what am I getting out of this? So I'm getting help navigating the marketplace. I'm getting multiple vintage years. I have a potential passive income stream. I'm getting that full value of the carbon credit. And then of course, we know that there's other benefits to making these practice changes. So you have better soil health, your potential for better yields over time. You have the ability to kind of sell this regenerative farming story to consumers, which I think is a really something that consumers want right now, and potentially that gives you a premium price. And then I love that, you know, over time in the past, farmers have not been able to be a part of the climate conversation, and farmers have the ability to store all of this carbon. And even if it's not something that maybe if you're not considering like the climate change piece of this as much as you are an income stream, there's ways to still shape that industry and be a part of that conversation. And I think that's really important for growers too. So we can go to the next slide. So finally, is it worth it? You kind of have to ask yourself the questions. Am I willing to put this much time into this? Am I going to make enough money to cover that verification cost? The range of total payment for Nori's farmers have been from $14,000 to $560,000 per one grower. We had made $560,000, and he did have about 5,000 acres. And at the time we were paying a few more vintage credits. So it's probably more in like the $100,000 range that you would see. And we've paid over $2 million directly to US farmers. So I think that you kind of have to keep those things in mind. And if you're thinking about it in a way that I've already made this decision, I've already made these practice changes, now I can make money off of this, I think that's really what you have to think about. We are working to make the enrollment process simpler, to shorten the total time it takes from start to finish, and to cut some of those verification costs. And then potentially like be a little bit, we would like to be really inclusive to smaller farms. Right now, it doesn't make as much sense for a small farm because you may not be sequestering as much, or you may be sequestering a lot of carbon, but if you have to pay that $10,000 verification cost, it doesn't really make sense. So we don't have an acre limitation, but it makes the most sense to have 500 acres or more because you have to make at least $10,000 to cover that verification cost. So those are some of the things that we're looking into too. I would say with that in mind that it also depends on what your soil type. So the DayCent model takes into account soil types, practice changes. So if you're stacking practice changes, it's still worth a look. I think you can potentially, if you're putting on, let's say you have no-till cover crops and you've started adding manure, there is potential to be sequestering a lot of carbon that if you have 300 acres, that still could earn you enough to cover that verification cost. So I don't ever want to say, if you don't have 500 acres, you can't do this. You just have to kind of take a look and see. So, yeah, I think that's it. And if you have any questions, you can always email us at hello.nori or at nori.com for any questions or just getting any information. We like to be a place that farmers can come and get some help navigating this really confusing industry. Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much, Jada. And now Christine and I will do our best to go through the questions and weave some together and have folks answer. I know that there were a couple of questions about acreage and small farms. I think Jada just answered that really well. I will though invite Bill or Kris, if you have anything more you want to share about small farms, this could be a good moment for that.
Nothing to really specific to add at this time.
Okay. All right, great. Christine, do you want me to hop in with some things I'm noticing or, yeah, okay. Also, I'll point out that I noticed some really great answers coming from Kris in the chat to some of the questions. So the ones that Kris answered thoroughly in the chat, I will let those stand, but I'm gonna point out some questions that are relevant to all of you, as well as maybe some questions that Kris, you might want to go into a little more. So for example, there was a question from a registrant or from a attendee about the grazing plan, and at the end of their question, they asked if there are years where ranchers have to deviate from their grazing plan, how does that affect their credits? And I was curious if you could share more about that, Kris. And I think that that's actually really relevant to Bill and Jada in their own context too, when people have to actually deviate from their plan.
Yeah, so at Three Creeks, we're definitely building from the ground up. We have in place through our new NEPA the requirements of the grazing system. So that's what our ranchers are adhering to right now, is a NEPA requirement for grazing timing and duration on the landscape. That's not required by the carbon markets in any way at all. So the agreement for the carbon markets will probably be the grazing plan on these federal lands. And so if we need to deviate, I don't think, well, in the NEPA, it's not a problem. Those contingencies are written in, and I would assume that that wouldn't be a problem in the carbon markets either. We'll see.
Yeah, for our program, I kind of talked a little bit about our force majeure clause, that if you do have to do something non-regenerative, we do understand that. But Nori doesn't want to prescribe practices. And so you are really telling us what you are doing. And as long as the carbon is staying sequestered, so as long as you're still doing regenerative practices and not releasing more carbon, we don't mind what plan you make. So you wanted to add more additional stacking, you could do that. You could add manure one year and cover crops the next year and continue doing that, and just let us know.
Yeah, and for us, yes, we always have a plan, and it always changes. So, but we're required, like with BLM, to have a growing season plan. And with native, we have to submit a report once a year on every place we were at, every move we made, because that's really important of how they're looking at their projects in terms of how people are moving landscape or cattle across the landscape. But in our world, the principles of what we're doing will change, but there's just all kinds of things with weather, drought, fire, personal stuff. So change is inevitable. We just try to manage it.
Thanks all. So this is an interesting question that has a bit of framing ahead of it. It's about tipping point theory, which suggests that for new technology to move from weird fringe to mass adoption, 15% of the population needs to adopt it. But for management and social change, 25% of the population has to adopt it. So wondering if you could all share about the 25% of early adopters who have been the brave folks to make rotational grazing normalized, but I'll also say in the cropping world as well, to make regenerative agriculture normalized. So it's kind of a more philosophical question, but yeah, do you want to share about early adoption?
Bill, I feel like you should start.
We're all jumping in because it's such an easy question. I think it's a wonderful question. I'm thinking, why? God, how could we actually measure that or be thoughtful about measuring it? So in terms of like rotational grazing, I would just say overall, I think, at least in our part of the world, ranchers generally are doing a lot better job about taking care of grass than they were maybe 50 years ago or 40 years ago. There's all forms of rotational grazing, which is basically the concept that, yeah, you got to provide, no matter what you're doing, you got to provide a sufficient recovery period for the plant. So that could be 3 rotations a year, it could be 300, depending on your context. But in terms of the social deal and the appreciation for an openness to applying these different management strategies and working with different people and creating sort of a different type of culture, in terms of how people support each other, I think that's been somewhat almost dramatic. I kind of work in the field as a facilitator with working groups in Montana, watershed groups, and we have a watershed coalition here in the Muscle Shale, and then the other groups I mentioned, with ACES and RSA, and I'm just kind of amazed how those groups are growing and getting more nuanced and more sophisticated, working with more partners, experimenting, bringing in new ideas, very open and transparent. I'm probably being maybe over the top a little bit because I look at the world that way sometimes, but people are collaborating, at least in the circles I'm in, a lot more than they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago. There's an appreciation of the culture is going to work if we work together. And I think people in Eastern Montana realize, because of the difficultness of making a living in this part of the world by working together, we're sort of improving our ability to kind of make all of our situations work. So I think on that, 25%, is a tipping. I just think we have maybe had a tipping point, but at the same time, yeah, there's still a lot of conflict in the world, in our area too, that people don't necessarily agree with what we're doing. So that's a great question. I wish we could I wish I could measure, but I'm going to stop now. I'd love to hear what the others have to say, or people in the audience for that matter.
I'll jump in if we want to keep going on this question. I think, Bill, you said everything. I think what I've been seeing in the Intermountain West is the same thing as groups coming together, groups of stakeholder-led groups, rancher-led groups coming together, and then pulling the agencies in with them to think about how to do things different on the landscape and think about managing landscapes differently. And I feel like those nodes of inquiry are spreading. I think in the academic world, which is where I came from and then escaped from, there's still a debate about whether rotational grazing or season-long grazing is better for cows and better for the landscape. And I think that that debate is happening in academic walls, which I think is silly. If you look at what's happening in the nodes on the ground, the land, as Bill was saying, I think people know that rotation and adding more rest into these systems has a lot of benefit. And I think another piece, I work on public lands a lot. And so then there's a question of, are we allowed to do these new innovative systems on public lands? And do we have kind of the freedom to do that within the regulations that are in those systems? And some people will argue no, that we need to change those regulations. And I think, the Three Creeks project, for example, is happening on 60% public lands, and they've managed to come up with a system that adds more flexibility, that allows more rest into the system. So I think people are thinking of these new creative ways to reach that 25% tipping point.
Jada, you want to jump in on this?
I think I will, I'm answering some of the questions in the chat too. So I think I think both of you guys did a really good job of answering that. So I'll leave it to that.
Great. We had a question about fertilizer. Curious if producers are being approached and asked to fertilize native grasslands and overseed, and they mentioned that they have a client who was, and they have concerns about adding synthetic fertilizer rather than changing management practices. So I think this is specific in some ways to the grazing world, but though Jada, you might have some thoughts too on synthetic fertilizers in the cropping world as well.
Yeah, will you say it one more time, Leah? I'm sorry, I just
Yeah.
finished.
Yeah, I know you're doing questions in the chat too, so I totally get it. So fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers, is that an allowable practice? And there's concerns about that because changing practices seems like a better move than using synthetic fertilizers.
Yeah, so for our program, synthetic fertilizer is allowed, and Nori is really concerned with just carbon removal. So at this point, and this could change over time, but we're not looking at other greenhouse gas emissions. And so we do, for this model, the DASENT model does take into account synthetic nitrogen, but we don't account for other synthetic fertilizers, but they definitely are allowable. I've also seen people kind of doing a little bit more nitrogen management and adding manure. So there are practice changes that you can do that can be accounted for in our modeling too.
In our case, yeah, no, I think the size of operations, the scale of landscapes, I just had our big white dog show up here. Fertilization is not really an option. It's just an input that we really, depending on how weather even affects those kind of things, no, we don't look at that. But I might add that a lot of places in the West, and it sure includes Eastern Montana, that, there's a lot of crested wheat planted, way back in the Dust Bowl when things were falling apart. And those grasses continue to be kind of a challenge in terms of their root systems, their monoculture aspect, and how to move succession with natives either into those through really high intensity grazing or just trying to get rid of them. You could farm them, but that's difficult because you could tear them out and plan to put something back, but then you could hit a drought. And then probably kind of a controversial one is, so we have done a few places where a practice for getting rid of crested wheat and using cover crops is they actually spray out the crested wheat. Plant cover crops, don't till the ground at all. Do a couple of years of cover crops and then turn it back, then plant natives back into it. But that spray application is controversial, understandably. And so I don't know, we're still trying to figure out ways that you could more naturally transition crested wheat into a more diverse stand.
Thank you. Kris, is there anything you wanted to add on this? No? Okay. So for this last bit, we're going to be done with Q&A. I know we missed a lot of questions, but I'm wondering if speakers, you could share your contact info in the chat so folks could follow up with you. And then we want to hear from you right now. So we have a question we thought would be interesting to get input on from the audience. So how this works is you'll go to this link that I'm sharing in the chat. And once you go there, you'll see this question pop up and then you can respond to it. So one of the, the reason we're doing this is to help producers navigate carbon markets, figure out if they're right for them. Jada shared a lot of info about ways that, she sees that we could improve these markets for producers. And we'd love to hear from you. How do you feel like we can improve carbon markets to better support producers? How can we have it be about you? And so if you'd be willing to go in there and respond, we'd love to see your responses, and they should populate live on here. Let me know if for any reason it's not working. We'll give you a couple minutes. And thank you. Yeah, the contact info is coming into the chat. Kind of fun to see the things coming up. So the way the word cloud works is if multiple people say something, it gets bigger. So I'm seeing the word simplify is bigger in the middle, and that makes a lot of sense. So how can we simplify it for producers so that they can enter it? Yeah, I see the word easier, holistic, reliable, smaller farms are welcome. Security with liability, simplified data collection. Great, thank you all. And then so these are all things that we can chew on, work on together. I'm gonna move to the next question. You can always share your thoughts in the chat if we miss you, but we just also like to hear now about how this webinar helped you. So we'd like to hear if you gain new knowledge, if you can apply the concepts, and if you're feeling more confident in your ability to assess carbon projects for your operation. And I'll leave it here for a couple minutes. All right, I'm gonna leave it here for another 30 seconds, so get your responses in while you can.
Where do you enter the responses?
Oh, it's in this link in the chat. I will resend the link. Maybe maybe you didn't see it. So you gotta click this link in the chat and then the questions will pop up. All right, and then last question is, helps us know how to keep helping you. What questions remain unanswered? So we have 2 more webinars in this series. We'll do our best to answer questions that you all still have, but what do you feel like we haven't covered? What do you still want to know about? I see how to best compare one marketplace developer seller over another. Yes. Soil carbon protocols, which ones have the best cost benefit analysis? Great. What are the other carbon markets? Larger farms are often the ones with least conservation practices, but they're the targeted ones. Very good point. Thank you all. These are great questions. So I'll leave that available to answer if you'd like to keep answering, but since we're wrapping up, we just want to let you know, thank you for being here. It's been really, really interesting to explore this with you, and we hope it was really helpful to you. And thank you to our speakers. That was just great information, and I hope you all reach out to them with any questions you have. We're meeting again next Tuesday, same time, same place, same link, to talk about whether how to evaluate carbon projects and whether they're right for you. And then our final one is about alternatives to carbon markets, ecosystem services, and equity and inclusion within carbon market spaces. And with that, I think that's that's it. All right, thank you. We'll see you next week.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye. You want to press stop record? Christine, I don't know why I don't seem to have abilities right now.
Yeah, let me see. I don't think I'm able to stop recording because I'm not the one that's recording it. I'm not seeing a thing. I see the recording little red dot, but
Well, I'll just end it. And then if you want to follow up, we can follow up. Nice
All
work.
right. You too.
Bye.
Bye.